Support for today's episode comes from Amazon. Amazon is working toward a carbon free energy future, doing more with less, investing where it matters most, and supporting communities where we operate. The constraints are compounding. Most planning models aren't. Power availability, water access, permitting timelines, and capital deployment are no longer separate variables. They are arriving together on the same projects, forcing a different approach to planning, siting, and investment. Companies have spent years building strategies around individual constraints. Energy teams manage power, regulatory teams manage permits, finance manages capital, operations manages execution. The problem emerging in 2026 is that these constraints increasingly arrive together. When they do, the issue is no longer whether each function can solve its own challenge. It is whether the organization has a planning model capable of understanding how those challenges compound. Too few do. That's the gap worth closing before the second half starts. Why functional planning breaks down under simultaneous constraints. The functional model works reasonably well when constraints arrive one at a time. A permitting delay extends the timeline. Finance adjusts, the project moves. But when a project encounters a permitting delay, an interconnection queue, a water access question, and a capital deployment mismatch in the same planning cycle, no single function has the authority or the visibility to resolve all four. Each team is solving for its own variable. Nobody is solving for the interaction. That interaction is where the real cost accumulates. A project sitting in a permitting queue isn't just delayed. It's carrying capital that isn't earning returns, creating covenant exposure if debt structures assumed a specific timeline, and potentially facing additional costs or queue-related milestones that can jeopardize project economics if schedules continue to slip. Organizations continue to plan investments in isolation from system constraints, increasing exposure when projects reach execution and infrastructure capacity proves insufficient. The cost shows up quietly: stretched payback periods, stranded capability, reduced operational flexibility. The functional model also tends to treat constraints as temporary. Energy teams assume power will eventually be available. Permitting teams assume approvals will eventually clear. That assumption is harder to sustain in 2026 than it was 2 years ago. Morgan Lewis's May 2026 analysis of federal permitting noted that while permitting reforms are intended to accelerate development, ongoing litigation and implementation challenges continue to create uncertainty around project timelines. That's not a temporary condition, it's a structural one. What compounding looks like in practice. Consider a manufacturing expansion that needs a new utility connection. It enters an interconnection queue that in many regions now runs several years. The site under consideration sits in a water basin where permitting for new withdrawals has become more contested and time-consuming. The capital allocated to the project was structured around a timeline that the permitting and interconnection realities don't support. And the regulatory environment governing the facility's emissions profile is shifting at the state level, with no unified federal standard to plan against. Each of those problems has a functional owner. Together, they describe a project that requires a different kind of coordination than the current planning structure provides. PwC's 2026 Infrastructure Outlook identified exactly this dynamic. Infrastructure investors and owners face compounding pressures from unprecedented capital levels, combined with the need for interoperability across systems, labor, technologies, and organizations when multiple stakeholders and funding sources converge on a single project. That interoperability problem doesn't resolve itself through better individual functional performance. It requires a different planning architecture. The permitting dimension alone illustrates the compounding effect. The National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, review process, Clean Water Act, CWA, Sections 401 and 404, and state-level environmental review requirements each have their own timelines and litigation exposure. The National Petroleum Council's December 2025 permitting report described how these processes have become structural impediments to timely infrastructure delivery, compounded by litigation that, even when unsuccessful at stopping a project, can add significant time to project timelines. A project navigating all three simultaneously is not facing three separate delays. It is facing a delay that grows longer than the sum of its parts because each process can restart or extend based on what happens in the others. An 18-month permitting delay is not simply an 18-month delay. It can extend financing costs, alter interconnection assumptions, shift equipment procurement schedules, affect water planning requirements, and push projects into different regulatory environments than those contemplated at approval. The result is that the impact of a delay grows as it interacts with other constraints. That is what compounding looks like in practice, and it is why the individual functional owner rarely has the full picture of what a delay actually costs. The planning model that fits the current environment. The organizations managing these conditions most effectively aren't the ones with the most aggressive capital deployment targets. They're the ones that have pulled constraint mapping earlier into the planning process, before sites are selected and capital is committed, rather than after. That means identifying interconnection queue positions and estimated timelines at the site selection stage, not after a lease is signed. It means understanding water rights availability and the regulatory trajectory of water permitting in a target region before a project enters detailed engineering. It means stress testing financial structures against timeline scenarios that include permitting delays of 12, 18, and 24 months rather than assuming the base case. When it comes to AI infrastructure capital planning, the question is no longer whether AI will require substantial infrastructure support, but how those requirements reshape the financial pathways available. The same reframe applies across sectors. Increasingly, project viability is being determined by physical and regulatory constraints rather than the availability of capital alone. The binding constraints are physical: power, water, permitting capacity, and the labor to execute once approval's clear. The organizations that recognize this early enough to build it into their planning models will make better decisions about where to invest, how to structure capital, and which projects to advance. The ones that continue managing constraints as individual functional problems will keep discovering the interaction cost after it's already embedded in the project. Sustainability Soundbites Energy coverage is sponsored by Amazon. Visit the link in our show notes to learn more about Amazon's spotlight on energy. For sponsorship opportunities with Environment and Energy Leader, please reach out to a member of our team.